The battlefield was chaos when I found her. Smoke from burning metal choked the air, and the cries of soldiers carried across the ruined clearing. I was only a medic, a human volunteer working among an empire that still regarded me as fragile, but my instincts had always been simple. If someone is bleeding, you stop it. The queen herself lay propped against a shattered stone, her armor dented, crimson spilling where a blade had pierced the seam between plates. Her guards formed a ring around her, shouting in their own tongue, unwilling to let me close. They were noble, proud, and fanatical, but none of them knew how to stop the flow. They pressed at the wound clumsily, their hands trembling, panic overriding discipline. She was fading before their eyes, and still they argued about protocol. I pushed through them before they decided whether to strike me down. I had been in worse triage situations on Earth, and indecision had killed more patients than enemy fire. My kit was already in my hand, gauze, sealant, coagulant spray. She tried to lift her arm to wave me off, eyes narrowing at the insult of a human touching her royal body. Her lips formed words that sounded like denial, but her strength failed before the order left her tongue. Her blood was hot against my gloves, thicker than human, and it pulsed in short bursts. If I didn't act, she had minutes at best. I pressed my palm against the wound and reached for the sealant. My fingers slipped lower than I intended, brushing against the curve of her side where the armored plates had shifted. The reaction was immediate and startling. Her body arched, her breath caught, and a sound escaped her lips that froze every soldier present. It was not pain. It was something raw, instinctive, startlingly intimate. The guard's blades were halfway drawn before she raised a trembling hand to halt them. Her gaze locked on mine, and for the first time I saw not a monarch or a warrior, but something entirely different, an expression torn between shock, need, and fury at her own helplessness. I thought I had hurt her, that I had pressed on a nerve and caused unnecessary agony. I stammered an apology, shifted my grip, tried to focus on sealing the wound. But she would not let my hand move away. Her fingers, still blood-slick and trembling, gripped my wrist with surprising strength. The sound she had made echoed in my ears while confusion spread through the ranks of her retinue. They whispered in their language, and though I only caught fragments, the tone was unmistakable. Disbelief and fear. I finished dressing the wound as best I could, but her eyes never left mine, glowing faintly in the haze of pain and something deeper. One of the elder priests finally spoke, his voice hoarse with awe. He named what had happened, a word I didn't understand at first, then repeated in the trade tongue. Heat. The queen's first and only heat. Murmurs broke out among the guards, curses, prayers, declarations that fate itself had been invoked. I stood there, confused, exhausted, hands shaking with adrenaline, while their world shifted around me. I had only tried to save a life, yet they were staring at me as though I had committed either a miracle or a crime too vast to comprehend. They explained in fragments, some shouting, some accusing, others defending. Her people experienced the heat once in their lives, a singular moment when their body recognized the only possible mate who could continue their line. It was not chosen. It could not be forced. Entire dynasties had waited centuries for it, their rulers passing without ever finding the bond. And I, a human medic, had triggered it by accident when my hand slipped. The absurdity of it rattled me, but the evidence was undeniable. The queen herself would not release my wrist, her breath uneven, her pulse racing in rhythm with mine. The guards demanded my execution to undo what they saw as blasphemy. The priests protested, insisting that destiny could not be ignored. And she, their queen, silenced them all with a single command. Her voice was weaker than before, but her authority was absolute. She declared that I was not to be harmed, that my presence was now tied to hers. The moment she spoke, the ring of blades lowered, but the hatred in their eyes did not. I had gone from tolerated outsider to something far more dangerous in their eyes. I tried to explain that it was an accident, that I had no understanding of their customs, no intention to interfere with their sacred biology. But my words were empty against the reality they believed. In their culture, instinct was truth, and instinct had chosen me. The queen's breathing steadied, though her gaze never softened. She did not look at me with affection, nor with anger, but with certainty. I was tethered to her now in a way neither of us could undo. In the silence that followed, I realized the weight of what had just begun. To her people, she was the pinnacle of their line, the one who carried both throne and future. For her, the heat meant inevitability. For me, it was a mistake, a slip of the hand in the middle of chaos. Yet survival had never cared for intention. I had acted as I always did. Fast, decisive, practical. And now, that instinct had set into motion something I did not yet understand but could already feel closing in like a noose. The battlefield roared on in the distance, but for me, the war had just shifted into something far more dangerous than blood and steel. The palace was less forgiving than the battlefield. Out there, survival was obvious. Stop the bleeding, patch the wound, get the soldier moving again. Here, survival was slower, hidden behind curtains and carved stone, wrapped in ritual that weighed more heavily than armor. The queen moved with me wherever I was escorted, her attendants whispering that she should rest, that she should isolate, that she should resist the bond until they found a way to break it. But she refused every suggestion, her eyes sharp and unyielding as she matched my steps. To them, it looked like obsession. To me, it felt like being stalked by inevitability. I was summoned before the high chamber where nobles sat draped in finery, their gazes full of contempt. They accused me of foul play, of poisoning her body to trick her instincts. I reminded them I was a medic, not a sorcerer, and that my only intent had been to save her life. The words rang hollow in a hall where tradition mattered more than truth. They demanded she renounce me, but she did the opposite, declaring in front of them all that I had awakened what no royal suitor ever could. The fury in the chamber was palpable, fists slamming, voices rising. Their queen had just upended generations of political maneuvering with a single sentence. After that, eyes followed me everywhere. Some burned with hatred, others with calculation. I felt less like a man and more like a spark dropped into a powder keg. Assassins came first, slipping through the darkened corridors where guards should have been watching. One tried poison in my meal, forgetting that humans metabolized differently than her people. The reaction that should have killed me only gave me hours of fever, and by the time it passed, the queen had already executed the servant responsible. She watched me through the ordeal, never wavering, as though the fever itself was another test of worth. I wondered if she would have been disappointed had I died. When she spoke to me in private, her words carried none of the fire she displayed in public. She admitted she could feel me even across the palace, a steady pulse that anchored her in ways she could not explain. To her, distance was no barrier. The bond was constant, an undercurrent she could not ignore. She said when I moved, she sensed it. When I braced myself for danger, her body tightened in response. I tried to tell her again that it had been an accident, but she dismissed the word as irrelevant. In her eyes, instinct never lied, and if instinct had chosen me, there was no undoing it. I resisted her closeness as best I could. She was a monarch, bound by duty, and I was a medic who had stumbled into her world. I had no desire to be a piece on their political board. Yet every attempt to draw a line only convinced her further. My hesitation proved, in her view, that I was genuine, that I did not seek advantage. To her, that was the final proof I belonged. The irony was suffocating. Refusal in human logic meant distance. In hers, it meant trustworthiness. The court descended into factions. Nobles who had spent years maneuvering for favor now raged against the intrusion of an outsider. Priests who had long prophesied a destined bond argued that fate had finally spoken. Soldiers whispered that their queen had grown stronger since my arrival, more decisive, more resolute. Each day felt like walking a knife's edge. If I stumbled, I would not only fall but drag her throne into fire with me. One night, as the fires of the city flickered below the palace walls, she asked me why I had reached for her at all. I told her the truth, that I had not thought, that my body moved before my mind, the way it always did when blood spilled and lives were on the line. It was no more complicated than instinct. She smiled at that, a rare, unguarded expression, and said, "Then it was the same for both of us." The words unsettled me more than any blade pressed to my throat, because they held no malice, only certainty. The threats grew sharper. A rival noble attempted to ignite rebellion in the outer provinces, claiming the queen had been compromised by alien weakness. Soldiers loyal to him spread rumors that her will was no longer her own. In response, the queen tightened her grip on me, both figuratively and literally. She kept me close during councils, during meals, even during ceremonies, ignoring the fury of her advisors. I became not just her healer, but her visible declaration that she would not be swayed. Each time she leaned toward me, her court seethed. It was not strength or power that kept her alive through those days. It was simple details, the ones no one else noticed. A shadow moving the wrong way during a feast. The faint click of a crossbow trigger behind a curtain. The subtle discoloration of a cup of wine. I caught them because I had lived through chaos before, because survival had taught me to trust what looked wrong. Her people thought I was touched by fate, that I carried some alien gift. The truth was simpler. Humans had learned the hard way to see danger where others didn't, and that instinct saved us both again and again. By the time the council demanded a formal answer, the matter was no longer about whether I had caused the bond. It was about whether their empire could withstand it. They declared that a test was required, a trial that would prove or disprove what destiny had chosen. If I survived, the bond would stand. If I failed, it would be dissolved, and likely so would I. The queen agreed without hesitation, not because she doubted, but because she believed proving it would silence her enemies. I felt every gaze in that chamber weighing me, measuring me against centuries of tradition, and found myself smiling bitterly. I had not asked for this. I had only done what I always did, reacted, acted, survived. But survival had a way of dragging me into places where choices no longer belonged to me. The queen's bond was not something I could undo, and the trial ahead would not only test me, but decide whether her empire endured or burned. And though I wanted nothing to do with thrones or crowns, one truth had already settled into my bones. Walking away was no longer an option. The trial was announced as if it were a festival. Banners draped the palace walls, drums echoed through the city, and whispers spread like fire. To the people, it was a spectacle. To the nobles, it was a verdict. To me, it was another battlefield, though the weapons had changed. I was not to duel or fight, but to survive a gauntlet designed to expose frauds and pretenders. They called it the Ordeal of Flame, a rite said to reveal whether the bond between ruler and chosen was true. Legends claimed those unworthy were consumed by the trial's fury, while those accepted emerged unscathed. I suspected the reality was far less mystical, but no less lethal. The queen stood beside me as the rites began, her hand grazing mine where no one could see. She was calm, too calm, as if the outcome was already certain. I felt none of that certainty. My heart pounded as they led me into a vast chamber lit by pillars of molten light, its air sharp with metallic heat. Symbols etched into the stone glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with some unseen force. The nobles lined the edges, their gazes hungry for failure. Priests chanted, their voices weaving like threads into the oppressive atmosphere. I was to walk the path, endure each stage, and emerge at the far end. That was all. Yet no one who had entered without true bond had ever left alive. The first stage tested endurance. The heat pressed against my skin, suffocating, designed to overwhelm lungs and heart. Her people's bodies had adapted across generations to withstand it, but mine had not. Sweat poured down my face, my chest burning with every breath. Still, I remembered harsher fires, the choking fumes of burning ships, the stench of melting metal, the roar of collapsing buildings back on Earth. I pushed forward, step by step, reminding myself that this was no different. Pain was not a wall but a signal, and signals could be endured. By the time I crossed the first threshold, murmurs rippled through the chamber. The second stage tested focus. Illusions shimmered across the path, forms of enemies and fears drawn from memory. I saw comrades long gone, their faces accusing, their wounds fresh. I heard the screams of civilians I had failed to save, saw the ruins left behind by battles we had lost. The illusions clawed at me, demanding I crumble beneath their weight. But I knew ghosts. I had lived with them long before stepping into this chamber. I walked through them, unflinching, refusing to let guilt command me. When the illusions faded, silence gripped the nobles who had expected me to falter. The third stage tested instinct. Mechanical constructs, half living, half forged, emerged from the floor, their movements erratic, their claws dripping with venom. I had no weapons, only my hands and the reflexes honed by years of survival. They lunged and I reacted. Duck, twist, strike, movements older than thought. The constructs fell one by one, their venom spattering harmlessly against stone. The Queen's people believed instinct was fate given form. They could not see that mine was nothing divine, only the result of a lifetime of necessity. Yet when the last construct crumpled, the chamber erupted with awe. The final stage was not pain, illusion, or combat but choice. A single door stood ahead, split into two paths. One led back to the Queen, the other into shadow. The priests declared that a false bond would drive me toward escape, but a true bond would guide me back to her. The chamber waited, holding its breath. My body screamed for release, for cool air and safety. But the thought of her waiting beyond, unguarded, judged, betrayed, it drove my steps without hesitation. I pushed open the door that led to her, the chamber's glow flooding around me as the crowd erupted. When I emerged, she was already moving toward me, her face alight with something fiercer than triumph. She did not ask how it felt or what I had seen. She only placed her hand over my chest, where my heart still hammered, and whispered so only I could hear, "They cannot deny us now." The hall broke into chaos, some in adoration, others in outrage, but her words cut deeper than their clamor. For the first time, I understood this was no longer about survival. It was about what came next. The council's fury boiled over. Nobles shouted treason, priests proclaimed destiny, soldiers pounded their spears in thunderous rhythm. Lines were drawn in open view. Half the court declared me chosen, the other half declared war upon the Queen's defiance. The chamber, that had been designed to prove truth, now threatened to shatter the empire itself. And yet, in that storm, she remained steady, her hand still on my chest as though anchoring herself to me. I realized that the trial had not been for me alone. It had been for her, to show that her faith in instinct outweighed centuries of tradition. That night, the palace did not sleep. Supporters gathered in the courtyards, chanting her name. Opponents plotted in shadows, blades flashing beneath robes. I walked among guards who eyed me with suspicion, unsure whether I was savior or usurper. She ignored them all, calling me to her private chambers, her voice carrying the weight of command and intimacy alike. She asked if I understood what my survival meant, and when I hesitated, she told me plainly, I was now bound not just to her, but to her people's future. To refuse her was to fracture her reign. To accept was to stand against an empire divided. I wanted to tell her again that it had been an accident, that destiny was not written by clumsy hands and misplaced pressure. But the words caught in my throat. For all my denial, the truth was evident. The bond had changed her, sharpened her, emboldened her. It had also changed me, dragging me from healer to something else entirely. The more I resisted, the more it grew, like a thread pulling tighter each time I tried to cut it. In the days that followed, assassins returned with renewed ferocity, no longer subtle but desperate. Each attempt failed, not because I was untouchable, but because she refused to let me out of reach. At councils, she sat closer. At meals, she shared from my plate. In battle drills, she stood at my side. Every act was a declaration that she had chosen and would not be swayed. The whispers spread beyond the palace walls, and soon the streets echoed with the same question. If the Queen's bond was real, could anyone truly deny it? By the time the rebellion banners were raised in the provinces, it was no longer a private matter. My survival had lit a fire that would either forge her empire anew or consume it entirely. And whether I wished it or not, I stood at the heart of it, the accidental spark she refused to release. The rebellion struck with the force of a storm. Provinces once loyal declared independence overnight. Armies marched under banners soaked in old grudges, and the empire's foundations shook. To her enemies, my presence was the weakness they had waited for, the excuse to brand her unfit. To her allies, I became a symbol, a rallying point that proved their queen had transcended the old order. For me, it was nothing but another battlefield, one where survival meant not only saving my own life but holding together a nation on the brink of collapse. The first clash came at the outer gates. Rebels stormed forward with fury, shouting that they fought to free their queen from alien corruption. I saw the irony in their cries, men dying to protect her from the very bond that kept her alive. She led her soldiers from the front, refusing to hide behind walls, her voice carrying across the battlefield like steel. At her side, I fought not as a warrior, but as a medic-turned-survivor, improvising weapons from the wreckage around us, striking with the desperation of someone who had no other choice. Each time I faltered, I felt her steady gaze, as if she was drawing strength not from her armies, but from me. Days bled into nights, each skirmish carving scars into the empire. Supplies dwindled, morale faltered, and still the rebellion spread. I knew then that steel alone would not win this war. These people did not fight only with weapons. They fought with belief. They had been told their queen was tainted, that her bond to me was weakness, and they believed it because no one had shown them otherwise. If we were to survive, we needed more than swords. We needed to change the story. It was her idea, though she claimed it had come to her through instinct. We marched not to crush the rebels, but to face them in open sight, without blades raised. At the heart of their strongest host, before tens of thousands, she stood with me at her side, our bond visible in every movement, every shared glance. She declared before all that the bond was not corruption but strength, that her heat had not been stolen but awakened, and that her choice was hers alone. Her words rang like fire through the crowd. And then, in full view, she reached for me, not with command, not with demand, but with the simple certainty of someone who had already chosen. The silence that followed was heavier than any roar of battle. Some spat curses, others dropped their blades. Many stared with the same awe I had seen in the trial chamber, torn between loyalty to tradition and the undeniable truth before them. For the first time, I saw doubt fracture their rebellion, not from defeat of arms, but from the power of what they had witnessed. But not all could be swayed. The rival noble who had ignited the rebellion unleashed his final blow, a weapon forged in secrecy, its energy crackling with forbidden power. It tore across the field toward her, a force that could have ended her reign in a breath. Without thinking, I moved between it and her. The impact ripped through me, fire and ice consuming every nerve. For a moment I thought I had failed, that I would collapse into ash. But the bond burned hotter than the weapon's fury, a thread pulling me back where I should have been lost. When I opened my eyes, I was still standing, scorched but alive, the weapon's power broken. To her people, it was no accident. It was proof that the bond itself shielded me, proof that no force could sever what fate had tied. The noble's forces broke, his rebellion crumbling in the face of what they could not deny. Soldiers who had sworn to his cause fell to their knees, chanting the queen's name, their faith in tradition shattered by the sight of something greater. Victory came not with slaughter, but with surrender, the field transformed from battleground to altar. She stood before them, unbowed, her hand steady on mine, and in that moment the empire chose unity over division. In the aftermath, the palace was no less tense but no longer fractured. Nobles bowed reluctantly, priests proclaimed the bond as prophecy fulfilled, and soldiers spoke of the trial, the battlefield, and the weapon I had survived as stories to pass down. I was no longer just the medic who had slipped, no longer the alien outsider. I had become part of their myth, whether I wanted it or not. The queen ruled with a fire none could challenge, and every time she stood at her throne, she made certain I was visible at her side. In private, she asked me once more if I regretted that slip, that accidental brush that had ignited everything. I thought of the chaos, the blood, the betrayal, the countless nights I had stared at ceilings wondering if I should run. I thought of the assassin's blades, the trial's illusions, the rebellion's fire. And then I thought of her unyielding, fierce, unafraid to defy her world because of what instinct told her was true. I told her no, not because I believed in destiny, but because I had come to see that humanity's strength was not in avoiding accidents but in surviving them, in turning chaos into something new. The empire rebuilt, scar by scar. The nobles whispered still, but none dared defy openly. The people sang of a queen whose heat had been awakened not by design, but by truth. And I, who had once only wanted to heal and remain unseen, found myself woven into the center of a story that would outlive us both. The bond was no longer just hers. It had become the lifeline of an empire, and though I had never sought it, I could no longer imagine walking away. When I looked at her now, it was not just duty or inevitability that bound us. It was the knowledge that survival had brought us here, that instinct had carried us both, and that together, we had forged something neither of us could have foreseen. Perhaps it was fate. Perhaps it was nothing more than a hand slipping in the heat of battle. But whatever it was, it had remade us, and the empire would never be the same again.